Welcome. My name is Danielle Knapp. I'm the McCosh curator at the museum, and I'm so pleased to have you here with us tonight for our program. I'd like to start, as we always do at the University of Oregon when we gather together, especially when we'll be talking about artists who are responding to the land in their work, to start with the land acknowledgement. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional indigenous homelands of the Kalapuya people. Due to treaties with the U.S. government between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their homelands and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, their descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and continue to make important contributions to their community, to the state, and at large. I hope you may have noticed that we have new land acknowledgements on view in our lobby and on the outside of the building by Grand Ronde tribal member and Kalapuyan descendant Steph Littlebird. If you haven't had a chance to look at those yet, please do so today. We also express our respect for all of the federally recognized tribal nations of Oregon, the Burns Paiute tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation, the Coquel Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes, and we express our respect for all other displaced indigenous peoples who call Oregon home now. Our David and Ann McCosh Visiting Lecturer Series on Northwest Art is an annual program that I think we're maybe in our 8th or 9th year. I should have double-checked that, but always focused on topics related to Pacific Northwest art history and its 20th century and contemporary connections. This program is generously funded by the David and Ann McCosh Memorial Museum Endowment Fund. And although each year's lecture isn't always specifically focused on David McCosh, it is always inspired by the care that he and Ann put into their craft and the ways that they inspire and educate us to this day, and the generations of artists and appreciators of their work that continue to learn from their work. Tonight's speaker, Chloe Dye Sherpe, is currently the curator for the Lumiere Group and works on independent projects as a curator, writer, and lecturer. Her curatorial interests are diverse, including the intersection of art and climate studies and supporting the work of Indigenous artists throughout the United States and Canada. She earned a bachelor's in history from Whitworth University and a master's in art history from the University of Florida. And she and I have known each other for years through our shared interest in many areas of art and museum work. In her previous role as curator for the Museum of Northwest Art, she exhibited the work of over 150 artists and organized the museum's first national traveling exhibition. This summer, our McCosh Advisory Committee and I invited Chloe to visit the JSMA for the first time to, in what limited time she had with us for a few days, start to scratch away at some familiarity with some of the artists in our collection who are particularly well represented, like David McCosh and Morris Graves. And tonight she'll share her observations and impressions of this research in her talk, Unparalleled Discoveries. And following her presentation, we'll participate in Q&A. I mentioned too that this coming spring we'll have on view a selection of night drawings by David McCosh in our Focus Gallery. So if you're not yet familiar with night drawings, I think you might get a taste of that in this presentation, and there's also one on view among the many works by McCosh in our faculty lounge. So please join me in welcoming Chloe.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'll warn you, I'm a wandering speaker, so I'm going to try to stay behind the podium as best I can. Thank you so much for coming out on this very rainy day. I traveled down from Skagit Valley this morning, and the rain seemed to continue to follow me down as I move south. So just thank you for coming. Thank you for welcoming me to this beautiful museum. I'm just especially grateful to Danielle, the staff at JSMA. As Danielle mentioned, I came down a couple of months ago, spent several days here at the museum, and we looked at dozens of artworks. And so I'm very appreciative to the staff, especially the collections team, who were gracious to pull some of those artworks out for me. And of course, the McCosh Advisory Committee. I know that two of you are here this evening. So just thank you so much for welcoming me here. And I hope we have a great dialogue tonight. Today we're discussing what I'm calling unparalleled discoveries, beauty, nature, and self in the art of David McCosh and Morris Graves. When the museum invited me to come and work on a lecture, we explored a variety of topics. As I said, we looked at dozens of artworks. I don't know if you are aware, but the JSMA holds the largest collection of Morris's works on paper, so there are a lot of pieces to go through as we looked at the permanent collection and the archives to really analyze some visual connections about what these artists had in common, but also how they diverge. And I kind of came in with a certain idea as to what I wanted the talk to be. And then, of course, when you get into the archives and into the collection, that always changes. So we're talking about unparalleled discoveries. These artists had quite a different career, very different lives, very different paths, and we'll kind of go through their decades here. But it was a really unique experience for me because I was at the Museum of Northwest Art, so was familiar with Morris Graves and, of course, his contemporaries in Washington State. But the opportunity to look at his contemporaries in Oregon was very interesting to me. But first, who am I? Where did I come from? I want to explain why this topic in particular is really interesting to me. As Danielle mentioned, I was the curator at the Museum of Northwest Art before starting my current role at the Lumiere Group, which really relies heavily on my knowledge of art in this region. But before those curatorial roles, as you see, this image does not really relate to any of that. I was a graduate student at the University of Florida, and my thesis, the artwork that was the central focus of my thesis, is up on the screen. I love this piece. This is Hans Baldungrien's, which is Sabbath, and it was really the central piece of my thesis, and it really focused on the role of the viewer, the role of the artwork, and how artists use different modes. But before we really get in depth into the various decades, as I said, we're going to go 1930s, 40s, and 50s, kind of seeing what I view to be some artworks that are very consequential to each artist's career. I am a big fan of having some conversation, some dialogue. We'll see if this crowd is interested in doing that, but at the very least, I do want us to spend just a couple moments with some artworks together as we go through the talk. So we started out with one of my favorite works by each artist. Here is Goats by David McCosh. So I'll give you all just a few moments with it, and then if we have comments, we can take it from there. Yes. Please, yes, yeah. If you have something, go for it. Good. Okay. Right. That's great, thank you. I love this example. Yeah, I love the goats. Anything else? I mean, what do you see? What is going on? I guess I could use a visual thinking strategy question, which is, what is going on in this picture? Yeah.
Well, I think the more that I look at it, the more that the details become more pronounced, particularly in the far distance. You see the sea suddenly comes up. You see the trees, you see vegetation. At first glance, I think it's very a mix of abstract and figurative. But then slowly, movement. And then slowly the details kind of suddenly you see the pasture come down, trees, landscape.
Thank you. Yes, we'll do one more. Go ahead.
How well integrated they are
Right.
with the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
They are not sort of separate from it, but they are, shall we say, part of it.
Yeah.
And that's what really strikes
Mm-hmm.
me about this is how well integrated the animals are with the landscape.
Right. You don't always see the goats at first, because sometimes, for me, when I saw this, I read it in terms of abstraction. But then the more I looked at it, the more the lines came, the landscape, the various elements that I recognized as a landscape came through, and then visually it really came together for me. So this is 1959 by McCosh. Here's Morris Graves' Crow, Surf, and Moon from 1943. And I'll note that Morris said that this was one of his best artworks to date. When he painted this in 1943, he submitted several artworks to the Northwest exhibition that happened at the Seattle Art Museum every year at the time. And he said that this was one of the best ones that he had done and submitted to that exhibition. One aspect of this piece in particular that I really appreciate is how the crow is integrated into the lines of the landscape. So if the crow was not black, the line of the mountains continue along with the crow, the outline of the wing and the beak and the head. It's all compositionally feeding into one another. And we'll look at another piece of a bird later on that the director of the Detroit Institute of Art commented on, that the birds seemed to be within the landscape. They were all kind of coming together as one, and they were inseparable from one another. So I think this piece in particular is a really nice example of that. And again, 1943, we'll talk more about where Morris was at that time, but let's kind of dive into the decades. So as I mentioned, we're gonna look side by side the artists through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I just have a couple highlights or points to note on each slide, as well as some pieces that I think were really significant each year. I do want to note, though, two really important sources that I used when looking at Graves' work in particular. And that is Iridescent Light, The Emergence of Northwest Art, and that was by Dolores Tarzan Ahmet, and then Morris Graves' Selected Letters, which was edited by Vicki Halper and Lawrence Vong. But here we have in 1933, yes, it's a fantastic edited book of his letters, by the way. So if you're interested, I have a couple letters that I'll quote here in the talk tonight. Here we have 1933 Moor Swan. This was purchased by the Seattle Art Museum. Again, 1933, very early on in Morris's career. This is the year he graduated from high school, by the way. It won the first prize at the Northwest Annual Exhibition, and that's why it was purchased by the Seattle Art Museum. Then his studio burned down in 1935, and then he had a solo exhibit at Seattle Art Museum in 1936. So, there's lots of ups and downs in this decade for Morris, but it was also the decade that he started to meet the other figures in what I'll call the Northwest School, and we can talk more in depth about the school and whether it was a school, but he met Mark Tobey in 1938. We'll revisit Mark Tobey a little bit later on. This evening, but this is how long he would have known him, 1938. Now, the 1930s were a very busy time for Graves. As you can see, 4 paintings were completed for the WPA. He exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. he was starting to become more in contact with some galleries in New York. He was very hesitant to participate in shows at Willard Gallery, but a lot of these requests started to come in. And I have this great quote in a letter to Russell Graves, Morris's brother, that's dated September 17th, 1937. And Graves wrote this, quote, "It looks, by signs read today, that it will be a warmer winter than I had expected. For I have just learned that the Federal Art Project has seen fit to employ me. A Mr. Cahill, who is National Director for the Federal Art Project, in parentheses, which is to, quote, secure for the government the best in contemporary American painting, was in this city all last week. And on seeing some 24 of my canvases at the Seattle Art Museum, he told the state director to get me to painting mountain landscapes for the government and put me on at $94 a month." So that was Morris's thoughts on working for the WPA and the Federal Art Project, but his career was really starting to launch at this point. His style really resonated, and he was starting to have a really different perspective than some of the prevailing artistic movements, at this point, one of them being regionalism. So, they looked at realism and the kind of readability of art, so that's the visuals, how they could be understood by the viewer in a growingly abstract world. And of course, I'm referring to art in the United States, Canada, and Europe. But here we have Thomas Hart Benton, kind of a national figure, and then Vanessa Helder. But the 1930s, this was a period when movements like De Stijl, so Pied Mondrian, were really becoming very popular. Also, Surrealism, here's Jean Moreau. This kind of contrast with what was happening in some movements in Europe and what was happening in the United States is kind of a really fascinating look at how different communities were reacting to what was happening in the 1930s. So in 1908, Thomas Hart Benton studied in Paris. He met many members of this kind of European avant-garde, these artists who were working in modernism. And then he very famously returned to the United States and became, quote, the enemy of modernism. So this is then what his artwork looked like. He developed this slightly distorted, it's very mannered, this style. Think of mannerism in art. And it was really rooted in what he saw as the American life at this time. Homestead is a really nice example of that. We have an individual on the farm with the cattle, you've got the house, the windmill in the background. Now, Hart had met Diego Rivera in Paris, and scholars argue that he was then really influenced by some socially conscious work as well. I wanted to bring in a Pacific Northwest example with Vanessa Helder, because that's where our talk is really centered. So Vanessa Helder did 22 paintings that documented the Grand Coulee Dam and its creation that were completed between 1939 and 1941, and she really sought to capture this grand scale of this huge construction project that was happening in Eastern Washington. So this is Eastern Washington. It's a very wild landscape, but still, the composition is so carefully constructed. We have these perhaps hints that people live here, but we don't see any figures in this one. There are some workers and others, but I picked this in particular because you just have hints that people are here. We don't see them, but their labor is so important to this project, but we're still seeing this kind of, I don't know if it's intimate, but we see the tricycle. So is it a family? There are all of these questions that come through with this piece, but this residence almost looks abandoned, but we still have, the hope of the sunflowers. And again, this commitment to, this major undertaking. Because we'll talk about him a little bit later, I'm just bringing up that one of Thomas Hart Benton's famous mentees was Jackson Pollock. So here we have a Jackson Pollock from 1936. You can see this style continued through. So McCosh in the 1930s. David McCosh spent most of the 1920s in school. He was at Coe College in Iowa and then the Art Institute of Chicago, where he graduated in 1926 and then pursued his graduate studies there as well. He spent the rest of the decades traveling. He was in residencies, he was painting in France, Italy, England, and Ireland, and the 30s were similarly filled with very impressive residencies and exhibitions, fellowships, commissions. Of course, this is also the time that he met and married Anne, which is very important for his career and, of course, for the JSMA as well. And this is when they moved to Eugene to teach at the University of Oregon, where he would spend the next many decades here amongst your faculty. But two examples of his work in the 30s, one being one of my personal favorites. I love this untitled Nurse with Babies, and I'd love for you all to spend a little bit of time with this as well before we move on. But I think there's some really interesting kind of tidbits that we can pull from this piece in particular. Any comments? What do you see? What's happening here? It looks like a classroom. What do you see that makes it look like a classroom to you? Kind of the our upper right? Yeah, what else? Yeah. Right. Yes. Right. It's so carefully constructed because it would be then kind of interpreted on a larger scale. That's one reason why I like this piece in particular, because I think that it shows his extreme attention to detail, this planning of his work. Also, as I mentioned, both of these artists traveled extensively, but one thing that I saw, as a former Renaissance person, were some of these kind of subtle references here and the kind of the care and the relationships and perhaps some of these familiar compositions or shapes that we see throughout art history. This Madonna and Child with St. John came to mind almost right away when I saw this piece, but also how it's organized, how he took great care with the nurse, with the children. We've noticed that it looks perhaps like there's some teaching that's happening here. So this kind of blend in the early 30s of his interests, his training, perhaps what he's seen throughout his travels. So I think, a very interesting look into what McCosh was thinking about at the time. So in the 1940s, Morris really had about 4 main residences, houses, properties in his life. The first is the Rock. So the Rock is a home built on a cliff, essentially, on Whidbey Island, which is just outside of Anacortes. I don't know if anybody's familiar or has been to Anacortes, but probably overlooked the sound. It does not exist anymore, unfortunately. But 1940s, I'll just say, as an aside, I was in New Orleans last month and went to the National World War II Museum. And so, I was, knew intellectually, of course, all of the horrific events that would happen in the 30s and also the 40s at this time. But I think that being confronted with that in person right before this talk, as I was thinking about the 1940s and how Morris felt in the 1940s, all that kind of came to the forefront. So the 40s were really filled with highs and lows for Morris. As I said, he started to build the Rock in 1940 on Fidalgo Island. The director of the Detroit Institute of Art visited the Rock in 1943. He wrote a great letter on July 20th, and he said that, quote, "The place where he lives is indescribably beautiful. The house he built is perched on a rock like an eagle's nest." So Morris would take on these projects, these enormous construction projects, and kind of commit and pour all of his resources into them. and the rock is no exception. He also worked at the Seattle Art Museum from 1940 to 1942, and then he would work for 2 weeks at the museum, and then he would take 2 weeks off to paint. So for a time, it was a fairly productive period for him, which won't be the case at other times in his career. But he loved being at the Rock because he could listen to the sounds of nature, and then he had a process where he would listen, and then he would reinterpret that sound in his work. So I love, Untitled, Headless Waterbird. We already had someone mention the background and the finish of his work. I think this piece in particular is a really excellent example of that kind of finish and texture that he was able to accomplish, through very dedicated study, and then Chinese bronze in the form of a pheasant. So as I said, he worked at the Seattle Art Museum, so he had really great access to all of their collections of Asian art at the Seattle Art Museum, which, now and at the time were really such a fantastic and important part of that museum. So he had a productive time at the Rock, but it was cut short almost when the Rock was finished, when he was drafted into the Army. Now, there seemed to be some varying understandings as to whether he had submitted to be a conscientious objector or if he had intended to, but he hadn't quite done it yet by the time he was drafted. But nevertheless, he was denied that status and then was sent to Camp Roberts in California. He called the camp the, quote, zone of evil, and he became very depressed while he was in this camp, which was very busy, it was very noisy. He actually fled the camp twice. He really had very strong feelings that he did not want to participate in this war that was happening at the time, very deep moral convictions that he did not want to participate. And after about 11 months, the camp psychiatrist said that he could not adapt. He actually stopped speaking to anyone at the camp, and they let him leave in March of 1943. The rest of the decade was very busy. So you can see he discharged in 1943, and then solo shows in New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. He ended the decade with a trip to England and France. He'd been invited to do a commission, and then he got there and decided he didn't want to do the commission anymore. But unfortunately, the success didn't really seem to brighten his spirits. And then he started another significant home build in Edmonds, which is called Caerladen. It was built of cinder block. Actually, one of the first cinder block buildings, certainly in Washington State, but perhaps throughout the United States. So it's important in that way. And he really kind of get the sense that he wanted to wall himself off from the rest of the world. But Edmonds continued to get very busy, and there's a whole series from this time called Machine Age Noise, and it's just they look like gears, and they're whirring, and you can almost feel the rhythm of the machines in the work. And so, unfortunately, it did not bring him a place of solitude that he was really seeking. I think this quote is so important. Again, 1943, Elizabeth Bailey Willis was a close friend of Morris. He had several very close friends throughout his life. There are actually a lot of letters from them at this time. This is a quote from Iridescent Light, and I'll read it. "We must so live that we can sensitively search the phenomena of nature, from the lichen to the day moon, from the mist to the mountain, even from the molecule to the cosmos. And we must dream deeply down into the kelp beds and not let one fleck of significance of beauty pass unappraised and unquestioned and unanswered." It almost, in the synopsis, says what Morris was trying to do, I think, throughout his life. And I think the fact that he wrote that while at the Rock speaks to how close he felt to nature at the time, that he was able to observe nature, hear it, experience it firsthand. As someone who grew up in Skagit Valley and lives there now, this mist to the mountain really resonates with me. I was just at Pilchuck Glass School over the weekend, and it was misty, and that's how I described the weather to people when they asked how the event was. It kind of creates this kind of haze that brightens the colors, but also, even makes the brown of the dirt stand out. And then when I see artworks like this headless water bird standing on the rock, I can see that, this kind of wet sand, this dirt that has this texture to it, almost a flowing movement. Here we have the birds. So if you talk to art historians who specialize in Morris or artworks or artists of this Northwest period, they will say that the birds were really, of two series, the birds were one that were really kind of the height of Morris's style, Morris's career, and the other one we're not going to talk about, but it's the later paintings of flowers from the 1960s. I love the birds, but I'll talk about what my actual favorite series is when we get there. But here we have Eagle of the Inner Eye. He did several of these birds where they're almost engulfed by this rock. I see that here. You know, the same director of the Detroit Art Museum said that they almost looked like rock carvings. He said he referenced specifically Assyrian rock carvings, that's what they reminded him of. But early on, I mean, we have 1931, this untitled yearbook design, which is a part of the JSMA's collection of Morris Graves works on paper. This is the athletic section. Again, more birds. And then, you know, poignantly from 1943, Wounded Gull at the bottom there. Of course, from the around the time when he was incarcerated during World War II. Moving to McCosh in the 1940s, you know, another busy decade for McCosh. He had moved to Eugene, started teaching at the University of Oregon, and was in the midst of several post office murals. I have also the National Park Service, some early drawings there. You know, they're an extension of this 1930s style that he had, but I really think that the style starts to become more and more distinct and well-developed as we move through the 1930s, and we'll see some especially in the 1950s. I love this quote that's referenced by Leonard Kimbrell when he's citing a talk that McCosh did in 1942 at the Portland Art Museum about light, in which he says, quote, "The confusion between light as illumination and light as a property of color has always seemed to me to be one of the most baffling considerations of a painting. For my part as a painter, I know this has been confusing, and I have assumed that it might also be confusing for the observer." So we've already referenced light today, certainly in terms of color, but also in observation. But more, McCosh has a new landscape to observe as he's moved from the Midwest here to Oregon. And I think he's continuing to kind of grapple with that. He exhibits across the United States. He has a solo exhibition at the Portland Art Museum in 1946. You know, I kind of get the sense as I'm reading various quotes from McCosh in this decade that he's really trying to discover how to see the landscape and then translate that into his work. You know, again, we've already talked about that with the goats. You know, what does he see? What is he seeing as he's working on these pieces? And you know, we can see, I think, how transformative a one-year sabbatical that he had was for his artistic pursuits, because in 1949, his sabbatical started, and he traveled to Washington, Mexico, and New Mexico. And this sabbatical must have been important because he references it again in the 1950s as a time when he was really able to make a lot of progress in his work. It must have been extremely informative. This is my favorite series by Morris, these hibernating animals. So when we left Morris, he had just traveled to England and France. The 50s were really a decade of transition for Morris. He returned from Chartres really a changed person. And one of his best friends, Elizabeth Willis, commented that, quote, "He was never the same again. He really seemed to be disillusioned with art. You know, a lot of the work that he'd created at the time was destroyed. So we don't have access to it. And when he returned to the United States, he really poured his time and energy into Carolodden. You know, Morris was known for his pranks. He would go to gallery openings in Seattle with dead flowers tucked into his lapel of his jacket, as a kind of a way of, saying that this wasn't important, but he was also there. So there's kind of this, push and pull. He's playing with the audience a little bit. Now, everyone in the art world wanted to see Carolodden, of course, because they knew how lovely it must have been. The rock was beautiful from what we hear in the little photographs that we have at the time. But Morris was also really interested in being an architect and an interior designer as well. So people were really interested to see it. And it inspired him to have what a lot of art historians refer to as one of the first happenings that happened in the United States, certainly. And this happened in 1953 in the spring. Now, Morris had a group of close friends, and he invited them all over for dinner. So they had a lovely dinner outside on this large table. It was beautiful. They were very close. But then when that was done, they left all of the food out on the table. One of the artists, I believe it may have been Richard Gilkey, connected a sprinkler on the roof of the home, turned it on so that water was just gushing everywhere, getting on everything. They had sent invites to various people that Morris knew, and the invite said, "You are not invited to this dinner." And they thought, okay, well, this will be funny because people will come because either they won't read the invitation correctly or they'll just think that it's just kind of Morris, playing another joke on us. So the invite was for the next day. Well, of course, by the time the big group of invitees came, the food was wet. Some of it had started to mold. It was not very appeasing. They actually played a soundtrack of pigs fighting in the background. On top of that, they also made it physically difficult for the guests to come. So there was kind of a ditch and some barbed wire. They wanted to make it really difficult. Now, a couple of the guests thought that this was funny. There's a note that a writer was really entertained by this, and so he actually sat down and kind of started to contemplate, what did this mean? But certainly, friends of Morris or people who had been friends with Morris were not entertained by this, including Barbara and Clayton James. Barbara was one of the founding members of the Museum of Northwest Art. Barbara and Clayton had been very close to Morris and had a falling out. So that all happened in the spring of 1953. In September of 1953, Life magazine published the article, "Mystic Painters of the Northwest," which featured the artists Guy Anderson, Kenneth Callahan, Morris Graves, and Mark Tobey. Now, all of these artists had a connection to Skagit Valley, and as I said earlier, they had known each other for several decades, really, by this time. They had been friends, colleagues, rivals, all of it by the time this article came out. So I'm just curious, how many in this room are familiar with this Northwest school? A couple people. Okay, fantastic. I never know. It's interesting. I wrote a paper about Morris Graves in graduate school, and my professor, who's a modern art historian, had never heard of Morris Graves. This was at the University of Florida, but I don't know if that excuses her or not. There's distance between, but regardless, I was happy to educate the class on Morris. So it can be argued that Mark Tobey was the first Northwest artist to gain international recognition. He was the oldest individual in this group. He was born in 1890. He moved to Seattle and was one of the founders of Cornish Art School in the early 1920s. He had a solo exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum in 1935, and that's really the year that he starts to develop what is called his white writing, which you can see here in this later work from 1955. Also important to note that he received the first prize for painting at the Venice Biennale in 1958. So he's one of the first American painters to do that. So he's extremely important. I won't spend a lot of time with these three artists, but I do want to note some highlights and points of interest about them. Here we have Mark Tobey's Threading Light from 1942. And there have been a lot of comparisons, but there are no conclusions with the connection between Toby's white writing and then Jackson Pollock's drip paintings. So this is Full Fathom 5 from 1947. It's not the first drip painting, but it is considered to be the first major drip painting by Jackson Pollock. So, you know, I think there's some interesting points here about the artist's hand, how the artist moves through the picture plane, whether that's the canvas, the paper, what that connection is, that physical connection. But of course, Toby was also considering other elements of what we're calling the mystics, which some of these artists really did not care to be called by that term. Kenneth Callahan did not refer to himself as a mystic. Kenneth was born in Washington, raised in Montana, and I think that his work is very reflective of the landscape that he grew up in. I love this Voice in the Whirlwind from '61 because, I certainly see some of the landscapes of Eastern Washington and of Montana. It reminds me of some artists who are, working today and kind of looking at this landscape, the rock, the color of the rock, the feeling of being in these types of landscapes. He, as I said, rejected this mystic label, but he did really connect his work and nature. And his wife, Margaret, was really kind of considered to be the glue of this group of 4 artists and really kept them together. Interesting, several of these artists all worked at the Seattle Art Museum. Kenneth worked there for 2 decades, and he had this where he would off as a curator, and he had a studio at the museum. So he would take the summers off and he would paint at the Seattle Art Museum. This was all under Dr. Fuller. When Dr. Fuller left the museum and there's a new director, the new director was not really interested in having someone like that on staff, so Kenneth left the Seattle Art Museum. Guy Anderson was the youngest of the group. Him and Morris were very close. Probably the closest of this group. They also lived together in La Conner for a short period of time. Anderson spent most of his time in La Conner. His studio was just about a block away from the Museum of Northwest Art, and that museum in particular has many artworks by Anderson in their collection. He was hugely influenced by the landscape and just the kind of general mood of the Skagit Valley. But again, we can't forget that these artists also were very interested in works by Asian artists in the collection of Asian art at the Seattle Art Museum, but also all the indigenous artists who were working in Skagit Valley and throughout Washington State at the time. So they're really bringing all these influences into their work, and that can't be ignored. What's kind of one thing that's unique about Guy is that he actually didn't travel to Europe until 1966. So at a much later time than the rest of these artists, which I found kind of fascinating. He was very interested in staying in Skagit Valley. And then, of course, Morris. Bird and Egg from 1937. So these artists were at times friends, sometimes rivals, sometimes colleagues at various points of their friendship or relationships with one another. But I think it's fair to say that by 1953, they had largely kind of disbanded any close connection that they had, but still, important to note because that article really, in a way, put some of these artists kind of on the map and to the attention of readers across the United States. So as I said, these hibernating animals are some of my favorites by Morris, and in 1954, he moved to Ireland. He sold Caerladdon and used those funds to buy a home in Ireland in 1958. Unfortunately, much of his work in Ireland was destroyed, so really happy that there are so many of these hibernating animals at JSMA. You see in 1954 that he moved to Ireland with Richard Svare. Morris had three long-standing, more lengthy romantic relationships throughout his life, and Richard moved to Ireland with him from Caerladdon and from the records and letters that we read, Morris needed a lot of time away, so Richard would travel throughout Europe and then come back. But it seems to be, certainly from Morris's perspective, a very loving relationship, but a kind of a very tumultuous one as well. So they were together for several years. Richard's archives are held at the University of Washington. And again, in that book of edited letters that's published by JSMA, you can read a lot more about their relationship and the letters that they had to one another. But definitely a lot of ups and downs throughout that relationship, unfortunately. So we're coming to the night drawings, which Danielle mentioned early on in our talk today. And we'll end with McCosh in the 1950s. He was included in American Painting Today, 1950, that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Continued to have solo exhibitions throughout the United States. He had, in part like Kenneth Callahan, a very steady position here at the University of Oregon. I think that really allowed him to have this wonderful breadth of work. This decade, again, was very productive with his exhibitions. As I mentioned earlier, he applied for a sabbatical in 1953. There is documentation of that application, but he didn't actually go on a sabbatical until 1958 and 1959. But certainly, in that letter from the early 50s, talks about how influential his travels were to his work. And here's a quote from that unsubmitted sabbatical application I think is really important. Quote, "A penetrating observer is the same person whether he is observing a painting or nature, and the quality of his observation does not change. It was a pleasant and new experience for me to have persons whose interest in painting was slight respond to the meaning of the painting even though they still asked, 'What is it?' in some cases. They didn't ask, 'Why did you paint it?' which to me is a far more important question and the one that the painting itself should answer." That's McCosh on observation, on how do we observe nature and how does the artist experience and look at nature and then create a work about that or as a reflection of that nature. Now, I've learned a lot about McCosh's night drawings when I was here earlier, and I found it really fascinating that he did not name them night drawings, that was kind of a name that scholars put on them later, but they were called night drawings because he did them at night. So, since it was at night, he was not painting what he saw, but rather, I think, recalling a situation, a feeling, or perhaps an impression from an earlier observation. And I found again and again in research and reading about McCosh in this time period that scholars often cite his comments about Cézanne, which I think is really fascinating, and how Cézanne observed objects and a group of objects. So here we have side by side McCosh's night drawing and Cézanne still life with ginger jar, sugar bowl, and oranges, of course, from the very early 20th century. According to McCosh, and this is a quote from that talk, Cézanne would ask himself, how do I know, not what do I know, when starting a drawing? Cézanne really sought to create a fuller picture of the objects that he was really fascinated with in the painting. So what I like about this in particular is we have the tablecloth, which is almost suspended in time. It does not have weight. It draws our attention to the surface of the canvas because of the shape, but also the flatness of it. And to me, the only objects that have any real weight are the oranges in the center. They are highlighted. There's almost a beam of light shining right down on them. They're almost in the exact center, as if to say, these are what I want you to focus on. This is what real shape and weight and wholeness of an object is in painting at the time. They're the only objects that also seem steady. We can kind of rest our eyes and our vision on them as an anchor in the painting. And I just had this moment in thinking about the night drawings and kind of how I imagined this process being for McCosh of seeing, and that question that he had, he wants people to ask, why did he paint it? So here's that thought process as I imagined it. Both artists traveled the world. They also had carefully observed their immediate surroundings. But observing is not just what happens visually. I think we can feel, smell, touch our world. I can imagine McCosh at night with these night drawings. We've talked about line, color, shape, composition, kind of creating these gnarled tree limbs or roots or whatever they happen to be, and then this woods interior, which I imagine being what he's actually seen in the landscape, and then forest interior, it all coming together. So what he experienced, what he thought through and practiced with the night drawings, what he saw, and then the real forest, the real interior of that forest and what that must be. So for me, that's why he painted it. It's actually experiencing what is the real in this landscape. And here we have kind of him almost like penetrating deeper into that meeting and into that landscape. That's the end. That's where we'll end. We'll end in the late 1950s with that kind of cliffhanger. But